Okay, I think we've got enough on to get going. So, hello, my name is Stacey Strong, and I am co-director, along with Mary Crock, of the Sydney Centre for International Law. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, on whose land the University of Sydney stands, and the Gwigal people of the Darawal Nation, on whose land I am currently sitting. I pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who have joined us today. I recognize that First Nation sovereignty was never ceded, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. This is the third installment of our hot topic rapid response series on the Ukraine, offered in cooperation with the Transnational Law and Policy Center of the University of Wollongong. I'd like to thank Simran Singh and Andrew Netherington of the University of Sydney for their help in organizing this event, as well as Marcus Wagner, who is the director of the Transnational Law and Policy Center at Wollongong. We have the possibility of another webinar coming up in the future. We don't have any details for you, but kind of keep your eyes posted to your emails that might alert you to those events. So today's session features two national experts on refugee law. Both of them will speak less quickly than I am. Apologies for that, but I want to get through this introduction quickly so that we can get to the actual substance. Obviously, their bios are online and much more kind of in-depth than what I'm going to tell you today. As many of you may know, Professor Mary Crock is Professor of Public Law and co-director of the Sydney Centre for International Law here at Sydney. Her expertise spans immigration, citizenship, and refugee law, as well as disability rights and comparative law. Her publications include leading texts on Australian immigration and refugee law, as well as groundbreaking work on the intersections between disability, migration, and human rights. Mary maintains a practice alongside her academic research, which focuses on vulnerable migrants. Dr. Niamh Kinchin is a senior lecturer at the School of Law at the University of Wollongong. Niamh specializes in teaching public law subjects, as well as administrative law and constitutional law and refugee law. Niamh's primary research interests are refugees, law and technology in the displacement and migration context, which we will hear a bit more about today, as well as administrative justice and public law within international and Australian settings. Her current research focuses on the digital transformation of the Australian migration system. So we're going to start up with what sounds like a basic question, but which is actually more complicated than it may seem initially. So we're going to start with these definitional issues. So Niamh, could you start us off, please, by talking about the extent to which Ukrainians who have fled to other countries meet the definition of a refugee under international law?
Yeah, thank you, Stacey, and thank you so much for having me here today and having the ability to speak about such an important topic. Before I start talking about Ukraine, I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the forced displacement and humanitarian crises around the world that perhaps are not getting the same kind of media attention that as Ukraine is getting. For instance, we have a brutal war in Tigray in the northern Ethiopia, where 2.5 million people have fled in the last year and a half into Ethiopia and surrounding countries. We, of course, have 1.1 million Rohingya refugees fleeing from Myanmar since 2017. We can't forget Syria, Afghanistan, and South Sudan, amongst many others. So I just wanted to start with that acknowledgement before moving on to these issues. So the question is around the definitional concepts of a refugee in relation to Ukrainian refugees. And for this, I'm going to look at the definition in the Refugee Convention, which is under Article 1A2. Now, some of you will be familiar with this already, but just to go back over what that, or to explain what that says a person needs to prove in order to have refugee status determination, is they need to have a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership of a particular group. They also need to be able to show that they are unable or unwilling to avail themselves of the protection of their country of nationality because of that fear. And finally, importantly, they need to be outside the country of their nationality. So it's a relatively narrow definition that we start with. So do people fleeing Ukraine meet this definition? I think the first thing to note is that the Refugee Convention does not distinguish between peacetime and wartime. So there's no sense that persecution looks different if there is a war and if there is peace. And there's no sense that you would apply a higher standard of persecution just because there is war there. So that's the first thing that I really wanted to emphasize. So the second thing I thought would be important to look at was what UNHCR has said about that. I'm using that acronym, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. In their handbook, which goes, I think the last time it was updated was 2011, I think that's right. Initially, they said this about what we're going to call perhaps war refugees. Persons compelled to leave their country of origin as a result of international or national armed conflict are not normally considered refugees under the 1951 Convention or 1967 Protocol. The protocol needs to be read with the convention. However, in 2016, the UNHCR also issued some guidelines which sees quite a significant shift on this position. And it says here, rarely are modern day situations of armed conflict and violence characterized by violence that is not in one way or another aimed at particular populations, or which does not have a disproportionate effect on a particular population, establishing a causal link with one or more of the convention grounds. A convention ground is regularly imputed to groups of people based on their family, community, geographic, or other links. So that's a big shift, actually, with the attitude of UNHCR there, from saying not normally would fall under the convention to quite possibly would, depending upon sort of particular populations. So there is an element of distinction in that definition. So then we turn back to Ukraine and think about how this can apply. And I do think that I'm not going to be able to give a direct answer, because I think there are some difficulties in actually mapping on this definition to the Ukrainian situation. The first thing is around that, what we call nexus requirement. So for reasons of. The arguments that I've seen is like, what convention ground would Ukrainian people fall under, would be nationality, which makes a lot of sense. But I think the problem that we may find with that is that the case law tends to still want a distinction on nationality rather than applying to an entire country. So nationality in previous cases has generally been considered broader than narrow citizenship, and includes things like lack of nationality for stateless people, disenfranchisement because of inferior political status, perhaps of a certain group, where there's persecution based, targeted to people based on their perceived allegiance to like a predecessor state, and also other sometimes linguistically and other culturally distinct groups. So that's kind of been the approach of the courts, where there is still making a distinction. That doesn't mean that the courts haven't been willing to apply this idea of persecution to a majority population. It doesn't have to be a minority population, but still I'm not sure where the law says it applies to the entire country on the basis of that, of nationality. So it's a difficulty, I would say. The other is failure of state protection. So this is part of that need to show that that you are being persecuted. This could be a little tricky too, just in the legal sense, because some areas of Ukraine are obviously controlled by Russian forces, and may be controlled by Russian forces in the future. Now, it's quite easy to show that there's a failure of state protection in those regions. There clearly is, because there's control of Russia from Russia. Some areas of Ukraine are still controlled by Ukraine. And so in theory, there may not be a failure of state protection there. What you need to look at when you're looking at the failure of state protection is actual protection, the ability to protect, and whether it's forthcoming. I think you can make an argument there that that kind of protection that's being offered in places where Ukraine still holds power or is still in control is very unstable. And ultimately, the test for persecution is a forward-looking one, is whether or not it will be persecuted in the future. So I think that could be very difficult. So just summing up there, I think it's unclear, and we'll talk about sort of in a little bit as to what kind of broader protections can apply, but there are difficulties in mapping on that definition to the Ukrainians as is.
Thank you. Very, very useful to those of us who do not specialize in this particular area. Mary, are there other bodies of international law that might apply here to help us figure out kind of what the legal standards that are guiding our conduct are?
Well, I think Niamh's contribution there was very useful because she's really showing that although we talk about the fugitives from Ukraine as refugees, and we understand them very much in the traditional sense that we talk about refugees, in fact, international law is not at all clear when it comes to giving them entitlements. And I think the point to make here is refugee law is just one body of law. You also have international human rights law. People who are displaced across borders like this, in this circumstance, as we're going to see, and it's not just in the Ukraine, fugitives from all over the world, they become vulnerable to abuse and to exploitation and to all sorts of harms on other grounds as well. And so in terms, what you're looking for is you're looking for bodies of law that require receiving states, the states to which a person flees, requires those states not to send them back into a situation where they're going to die. And I think in some ways it's the broader protections of human rights law which are probably more useful here, in particular the right to life. These are not bounded by the same very complicated, very detailed requirements of refugee law. You also have anti-trafficking legislation now. So countries around the world, I think, have become much more alive to the issues of vulnerable people being forced out of their homes and across borders. These broader human rights protections are useful, particularly given that people become vulnerable when they're displaced. They don't have to cross borders to become vulnerable. And so international human rights law, I think, has a big role to play in offering protections to people.
Excellent, thank you. And again, that kind of cross-border expertise is very valuable to our listeners, I'm sure. So thinking now about how our own government is approaching the situation, Mary, do you have a view on kind of the Australian policy on the Ukrainian situation?
Well, look, I think it was very good that Niamh began. She's actually saved me some work here. We have to be conscious that these displacements are happening all over the world. We could add Yemen to the list, the long list that Niamh mentioned for us before. I think the Ukraine has drawn everybody's attention because it's new, it's fresh, perhaps also because these people are, very close to the traditional type of migrants that we've been getting into Australia. I think there's always sort of a deep-seated emotional reaction that countries have to particular episodes around the world. And I know that Ukraine really has struck a nerve for a lot of Australian people. I would just make the point that there's responses that I think the calling of the election has really helped refugees in Australia in recent times. We've seen an increase, for example, in the refugee intake, a more generous approach to the people fleeing Afghanistan, which is excellent. There are some really curious little tweaks that have happened to the law, allowing people who've been allowed into the country to actually apply for traditional visas that can only be sought if people are overseas. So the global humanitarian visas, they've actually opened that class of visas to people who are brought to Australia on temporary visas. The Ukrainians, very interesting. They're bringing in larger numbers and sometimes on a range of visas that the poor old Afghans would only dream of getting. For example, some of them are coming in on tourist visas. Go figure. That would just never happen for anybody from any other conflict zone around the world, I think. But what we've seen is that for the cohort who've been evacuated here, most of them, again, have been given these highly controlled temporary visas. That the problem with these particular visa classes, I don't want to get too technical, but we have a particular cohort of visas that are given to people even if they don't ask for them. And the problem with them is that they allow you to stay, but they really limit your rights going forward to apply for other visas. And I think that is why I find it interesting that we are letting some Ukrainians in on these other temporary visas, because the other temporary visas do give you access to applying for refugee status or for other humanitarian stay. And Australian domestic law now covers both people who meet the legislated definition of refugee. We've incorporated that into our domestic law, and also embraces the protections that are available under broader humanitarian and human rights law. So
just as a really quick follow-up on the visa situation, for some of those who are in on the very temporary visas that do not have further rights or the ability to apply, would they be able to step out of the country for literally a week, apply from outside the country, and then come back in? Or because the situation that arose initially was at the time that their, for example, tourist visa was given, are they forever barred from these longer and more important visas?
No, well, no, they're not forever barred. The people who really have a terrible time and will continue to have a terrible time are the people who came here by boat. So they are in a different cohort. And I think we have to acknowledge that Australia's behaviour in recent years to genuine refugees has been very, very patchy and has attracted a lot of criticism from around the world. Because of the election, again, we're seeing the current government trying to clean up its act a little bit, but there are still a lot of problems, and people have been staying in detention for years and years, even if they are recognised refugees. So in answer to your question though, Stacey, in theory, an individual who's here on one of these temporary visas could leave the country and come back again, but good luck getting into another country. That's the problem. You've got visas that appear to be there on paper, but in practice, you're fairly stuck in the country. And look, I think as Niamh has pointed out, it's not very clear that individuals who have got into Australia will meet the definition of refugee just because.
Okay, and I'm not sure if my internet is popping in.
Yeah. Can people hear me? Or it's just. Yeah, you can. Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. So look, it's not an obvious situation, and it's clearly a situation where you're going to need some government guidance and decisions on how these people are going to be treated. Okay. Have we lost Stacey?
I think we might have, yeah.
We might have lost Stacey. Yeah, she's unstable internet. Yeah.
Oh,
She's not back. So,
good.
So Marcus, did you step in for me and kind of segue over to Niamh's?
No, I was just going to jump in. So,
yeah.
Okay.
I think we're having a little bit of trouble with Stacey's web connection. So let me just jump in here then. And the next question that we have for I think it was Mary. Is there any comparison with respect to other places? And I think you started to mention this, right? And one that comes to mind almost obviously is Afghanistan, because we had a somewhat similar crisis not long ago.
Yeah.
And for Niamh, following up on that, is there something special that's being done with respect to Ukraine from the European side?
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
Look, I think we were going to. I might ask Niamh to actually start here. The question was, well, how do we compare to the rest of the world? What's the rest of the world doing?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Great. So I'll talk about Europe. I'm going to have a caveat here and say I am by no means an expert in EU law or European law, but it's really interesting to see what's happening in Europe. So in particular in the EU, on the 4th of March of this year, the European Council decided to enact for the very first time the 2001 Temporary Protection Directive. This was a unanimous vote, and a little surprising because although it's been sitting on the books since 2001, it had never been enacted. And even a couple of years ago, they were talking about repealing it. So what is the TPD? I'm just going to use that acronym. This applies to the EU countries, obviously. It applies to mass influx situations. And what that means, I think, is probably a little bit vague and maybe depending on political will. But ultimately, or sort of, it applies to situations for temporary protection where people are at risk of systematic or generalized violence. So already there, we have a broader definition than what I was talking about in relation to the Refugee Convention. It broadens that out to systematic and generalized violence. So just looking at what it means, first of all, eligibility. There's essentially 4 different categories of eligibility for the TPD. First is Ukrainian nationals that were legally residing in Ukraine before the 24th of February. The second is third country nationals or stateless persons who had received protection in Ukraine before that date. And the third is actually family members of those 2 groups. Interestingly, they have a 4th category as well, which are third country nationals who, or stateless persons, who were actually permanent residents in Ukraine as of 24th of February, but are unable to return in safe and durable conditions to their country of or region of origin. So I think this is where we see, I think some of us would have seen stories about international students trying to leave Ukraine. They would fall under the TPD as well. So the length of the TPD initially is for 1 year, but it's open to extension, first of all on 6-month periods. So that would bring up to 2 6-month periods that would bring it up to 2 years, and then potentially a 3rd year. So this is potentially temporary protection for 3 years. The rights that it gives Ukrainians is that the member states, they have to ensure access to suitable accommodation, social welfare, medical care, education, and to the courts. And in relation to movement, what is another really interesting thing about TPD is that Ukrainian people can move across the EU and choose the country in which they wish to lodge their application for the TPD. So they are not limited to this idea of first country of asylum, which has come through the EU law in other contexts. However, once they lodge their application for TPD, they cannot take that with them to other parts of the EU. They need to be limited to that country. And the member states, I believe, have in principle agreed that they won't apply any sort of take back rule. Under the directive, the beneficiaries of the TPD can lodge an application for refugee status at any time. And I should have mentioned in the first part that there is a possibility that individual Ukrainians will meet that definition in the Refugee Convention, but I guess I was trying to look at it broadly in relation to the mass influx situation. But however, member states do not need to assess it whilst the applicants are holding the TPD, so it can be delayed, but they're still able to actually apply for refugee status. Just on a couple of other countries, before I just make one comment about that, I think Norway, they had a long dormant part of their legislation, which is called sort of collective protection. They've initiated that. Denmark, when I last read about it, was looking to preparing special legislation that would work well with the TPD. I think also it's worth looking at UK. That seems to be a more fragmented and probably more problematic approach, the way that it so far has been implemented. So what the UK has done is implement essentially like a Ukrainian family scheme, so that any Ukrainians that have immediate or sort of close family in the UK can apply for a visa. And I believe it would last for 1 year, the temporary protection. So it doesn't just have to be spouses and minor children. That can extend to parents, grandparents, siblings, and children over 18. Besides that, however, they have to make that application in a visa application centre outside of the UK and I think they've got what we call VACs in Poland, Romania, Hungary, and Moldova. There is also an uncapped sponsorship scheme, which I think they call the Homes for Ukraine scheme. And this idea is to enable communities and individuals to open up their homes and their resources to Ukrainians that they don't have any kind of connection with. And the way this would work is that they offer Ukrainians a rent-free space for 6 months, and they don't have to provide living expenses, but they can if they choose to. This is the UK citizens. The UK citizens that choose to do this are vetted by the government, and there are security checks on the Ukrainians. And if you do open up your home or your space to Ukrainians, there's a £350 a month amount that you would get, which is tax-free up to 12 months. And the local authorities also receive a certain amount in tax-free funding, that are helping refugees. So the problem with that is just the administrative side of it. It's just been slow and complicated. And I can talk about that a little bit in a bit as to why, but a lot of it's to do with tech actually. But as of the 7th of March, I think it was, 7th of April, sorry, 40,900 UK visas had been issued, but only 12,000 people had actually reached the UK. So there are definitely some bottlenecks in relation to that system, and it has come under significant criticism. And the other thing that I just wanted to say about the TPD was, I think I might be preempting a question, is did they apply this to Syria in 2015? And I've already said that this was the first time they've ever applied it. So the answer is no. So your question may be why, which would be a good question. And I don't know that there's a very clear answer to that, but there are some things that you would be told, and then some things we can wonder about. The first thing would be that, as I said, this TPD relies on this idea of mass influx, which is really relies on the political will to implement it. There was, I think, an attitude that Syrian refugees are unlikely to have only short-term needs for protection, and that they would need long-term needs for protection. Well, I'm not really sure about the Ukrainian, sorry. There is a sort of geopolitical issue here too, is that Ukrainians already had the right to enter the EU for 90 days visa-free. So they already had a right of movement around the EU to a certain degree. So that probably makes some of the politics and some of the practicalities a bit different. But then, of course, I think you have to acknowledge the elephant in the room, as to perhaps this comes down to things like racism and discrimination, and a sense that I think Mary was sort of getting at before in relation to that the Ukrainians from a European perspective are like us. They are just like us. So they can, we understand them. And this idea that I've seen in the media where people say, well, Middle Eastern refugees, they're used to that because this is something that, conflict, etc. This is something they're used to. And I think I can quote one Greek official who said that Ukrainian refugees are real refugees. So we have that sort of attitude underlying a lot of these decisions that I don't think we can ignore either. So yeah, that's what I have on Europe. If I can hand over to Mary.
Well, look, I'm not going to give nearly as detailed an account of the other countries. I think the point to note here, though, is that Europe has the geographic proximity to Ukraine. These people are moving across borders physically through countries into Europe first. To get to Australia or Canada or any of the New World countries, you've got to be able to fly out. Don't even take boats anymore. So I think that instantly gives countries more control over who comes into the country. Having said that, the response that Australia has given has to be seen in the context of its close association with Canada and the US, New Zealand, and indeed the UK. You may be aware that Australia has made its own little geopolitical cluster for immigration purposes, and we swap and shop around policies and ideas. So you're going to see very similar policies being adopted in the US. Canada is a really interesting country, though, because of its long association with Ukrainian migrants. And for that reason, I think of all of the countries in the North American region, they have been most concerned about the conflict in Ukraine and most generous to Ukrainians physically in the country already, and wanting to reunite with family members. So what we're seeing, I think, both in Australia and also in the US and Canada, they're the main countries, the main comparator countries. You're seeing policies that start with the Ukrainians who are already in Australia, that then relaxes and allows the families to join them in the country. So I'm just looking at the US State Department website, and they really don't advertise any new programs, but they do refer to expedited processing of, as we have in Australia as well. We're copying each other's practices here again. But if you've got an ongoing visa application, they will expedite that to try and get people out sooner. So, yeah, I think the problem is not so immediate in these other countries. It's an immediate problem for Europe. And I think it's also a location where you can see most vividly the contrast between the approach that's been taken to the Syrians and other Middle Eastern migrants and refugees, and the fugitives from Ukraine. So.
Thank you, Mary, and Niamh as well. A very interesting comparison. As you say, countries are looking to what their cohorts are doing and kind of learning on the fly. We do have a question which we will take at the end, but I do encourage people to pop their questions into the chat, and we'll kind of compile it in the last 15 minutes. But let's move on to a topic that Niamh has identified already. Her area of expertise is on how technology kind of interacts with refugee situations. So Niamh, could we say that technology has been helping or hurting the current situation?
Yeah, that's a great that is a great question, and the answer is both. And so it's really interesting to see what's happening in Ukraine at the moment, and I've been keeping an eye on this. So just to give you a background on this conversation, and some of you will be across this, some of you will not, but in relation to the growing integration of technology in both the humanitarian spaces and refugees. Now, the idea of tech in this space is complex because it can be seen as tech for good. Humanitarian design, which can also, as long as it's including people in it, including refugees in it, can be good. Like, for example, you have things like health outcomes, social integration, even settlement, etc., can be used through tech. But then we're also seeing some potentially harmful technology grow up in this area. So technologies that mine and analyze personal data, and also surveillance technologies at the borders. So things I'm talking about here are things like Biden's wall. So Biden doesn't have a big brutal wall like Trump wanted to build, but he has a smart wall. And it's getting smarter all the time, I think. And it monitors people crossing across from the Mexican border. Frontex, which is Europe's border agency, has been using drones and other types of technologies to identify people coming across the Mediterranean in small boats for some time as well. They're growing in that area. Canada's been trialing machine learning, which is a type of artificial intelligence in its decision-making procedures for a number of years. And this is a classic, which is some of you might know about, but in between 2016 and 2018, Greece, Latvia and Hungary had a pilot where they piloted an automated lie detection system across the borders, where an avatar asked a person a whole lot of questions and then scanned your face for micro gestures to see if you were lying. And that was very controversial. So these sorts of things are going on. And there's a whole lot of issues there around human rights, right to privacy, etc. So this is a research interest of mine, as Stacey said. So I thought, what's happening in Ukraine? And I can see it's good, it's bad, and it's ugly. So first of all, the world asked for assistance with Ukraine, and the tech world definitely stood up. The big tech, the small tech. We see things like Vodafone making sure that it allowed, offered free mobile connectivity to 200,000 Ukraine refugees. Israel's Sheba Medical Center set up like a virtual hospital in Moldova to actually perform procedures virtually with people crossing the border. Google Business Profiles has launched like a new category of business where businesses register how they're helping refugees. So that's all for good. But then we have tech for good that can be potentially very damaging, even though well-meaning. So we see some of these sites being established that helping like match hosts with refugees. One instance is a very keen teenager from the States who set up a very successful COVID tracking website. Set up this kind of, I think it was called Homes for Refugees, and Ukraine Take Shelter. It's all well-meaning, but the problem is the security within that website is really below par, and there's no real proper vetting of hosts of actually taking refugees into their homes. So in their rush to kind of bring technology in quickly, they're not having the right sort of checks and balances, not actually coordinating with NGOs and refugee groups, etc. And I think one cybersecurity expert called it a Craigslist for pedophiles. So it's like, it's considerably concerning. And then the technology can be used in really malicious ways. In February, one of the Ukraine border control stations was struck with a data wiper cyber attack that slowed down all the processing. But then we have like technology that's kind of presented to us in a way that's almost value neutral, or as a way that can help governments be more efficient and therefore be more beneficial. So such things as biometrics and facial recognition. Biometrics have been used in the refugee space for a long time. UNHCR uses it for refugee registration. And it brings up a lot of concerns because it ultimately relies on refugee visibility, and therefore data can be misused, it can be abused, it can be shared for wrong reasons. Host countries might not have robust legislation, data protection legislation, and it may be shared with the state of persecution, for example. So there's a lot of concerns about that. In relation to Ukraine, at the moment where the biometrics is a problem is in relation to this administrative issue, because that's what's been holding up some of the issues in the UK, but also in Canada as well. So refugees had to go and register their biometrics in order to get their visas to go to the UK and to Canada. And that meant they had to travel a long way and get appointments, etc. So that's primarily what was causing that bottleneck. And I was just reading before this meeting that Canada have removed the requirement for biometrics for like low risk. So they're kind of, on getting on the bandwagon there. But I suppose one of the biggest, most dystopian issues is facial recognition. Some of you may be aware of the US company Clearview. Clearview is a facial recognition company that scrapes the web for faces and puts them in their database for use of facial recognition. It actually approached the Ukrainian government a little while back and offered its facial recognition technology for, I'll just quote, uncover infiltrators, including Russian military personnel, combat misinformation, identify the dead, and reunite refugees with their families. So at the moment, the Ukrainians are only using it to identify dead Russian soldiers and also potentially their own casualties. But I think it's very interesting in the casual way that reunite refugees with their families through facial recognition was thrown in there. I mean, think about how that might climb and how that might grow, and what are we going to see facial recognition eventually used in refugee credibility assessments? And that's quite dystopian to me. So it's concerning. Clearview's already completely fallen foul of the EU's General Data Protection Regulation and has been fined in Australia as well, as for breaching the Privacy Act. So it's a big concerning companies coming in there. And I think the last thing that I wanted to say about this, because I could talk about this forever, but the last thing that I wanted to say is what's striking to me is how tech actually shines a light of the inequities that we have already alluded to in relation to how Ukrainian situations been treated in previous. Now, Poland, at the end of last year, approved a 398 million 18-foot high wall, with cameras and motion sensors to be built on its border with Belarus. Now, this was in response to the refugee crisis that we know that was happening at the border over their winter with Syrian, Afghan, Iraqi refugees. There's no such talk of this sort of border in relation to Ukrainian refugees at the moment, but that certainly seems to be, to me, shines a real light on that sort of inequity. So I'll stop there, but I think it's a really interesting thing to watch, that tech is complicated and we need to keep our eye on it, because it can certainly create spaces that are maybe legal black holes, or certainly accountability black holes.
Thank you. And that's a question I think that none of us had actually thought about until you presented this, that technology is being used in this horrendous situation for both good and ill. One of the things you were saying, Niamh, is that there are the impact of technology on certain groups might be unequal depending on the nature of the use of the technology. Mary, could you talk a little bit more about people who are particularly vulnerable in this type of situation? We've actually had a question on the chat about this already as well, but how should the world be responding to concerns about particularly vulnerable individuals and groups?
Yeah, look, I think Niamh's presentation there on tech was really interesting. You may be interested to know that we are using facial recognition already in refugee cases, and I've come across instances where people's passports have been compared with other individuals. This has been going on for years, actually, and I think, as Niamh says, it's just becoming more sophisticated and accordingly more dangerous. So I think one of the ironies that I find with this increasingly sophisticated mechanisms for identifying people and for tracking where they go is that there hasn't been a commensurate attention given to particularly vulnerable groups. Now, we know that in the cohort of refugees or displaced persons leaving Ukraine at the moment, the vast majority are women and children. They're leaving their male relatives behind to fight, which is part of the tragedy. As soon as you put children and women alone on the road, their vulnerability is very obvious. There have been some absolutely heart-rending accounts on Twitter and other social media about parents writing the name and details and contact numbers on the back of their infant children in case they get separated from the children. My own research has shown that in any flow of refugees, you can expect 5% to be unaccompanied children. That's in a normal situation. In a situation like this, the possibilities of children being separated from their parents is much, much greater. And so I think you're going to have a much greater cohort of unaccompanied children. These are extraordinarily and very obviously very vulnerable refugees, displaced persons. In fact, if you look at the way that the Convention on the Rights of the Child operates, those children, I think it's arguable that they should be regarded as convention refugees. They should be given a special status. The other research that I've done has been around refugees who've got disabilities. And when we started our research, we found a very strong presumption in people that people with disabilities don't travel. They tend to die in greater numbers whenever there's a war or there's conflict or there's a disaster, but they can't travel. And what we found is that's absolutely not true. You can get war wounded, you can get people who have long-standing disabilities. What we found is that families don't want to leave their loved ones behind. And so again, in any cohort of displaced persons, you're going to get quite a large proportion, at least consummate with or relative to the normal identification of people with disabilities. The World Health Organization reports that between 2 and 10-15% of any population of people with disabilities. When we did a study or a study was done of people crossing the border from Syria. They found that, in fact, with age and the interrelationship of disability and injury, etc., you can get upwards of 30% of the people crossing as being people with disabilities. Now, I think UNHCR and IOM and other organisations responsible for these people on the move, they're doing their best to try and mainstream the treatment of the creation of policies and mechanisms to make sure that these people are not left behind. It's still absolutely a work in progress. And whenever you see a mass outflow like we're seeing at the moment, there are going to be problems there. I'll just very quickly note that when you get women and young girls in particular separated from family protection, you're going to find that they become more vulnerable to sexual abuse. You find that in any population of people with disabilities as well. Any sort of vulnerability often will play out in abusive experiences. And well, again, we're getting media reports of the treatment of women within Ukraine and how they have been kept as sex slaves. And we've seen this with the outflow from Syria as well. Sometimes families, when they have no other options, they will literally sell their young girls off into forced marriages, underage marriages. So the longer a conflict goes on, the more these vulnerable groups are at risk, and the more we have to stop and think about how we're going to deal with that, what we're going to do with it.
Thank you, Mary. Obviously, a very sobering type of issue. So thank you for addressing that. We have come into the question and answer portion of our session. So please do feel free to put your questions in the chat. I'm going to pop up to our very first question from Ann Har, who I think popped this into the chat when Niamh was speaking about the TPD and other new kind of regimes in Europe and other places. So the question is whether these new laws regarding Ukrainian refugees consequently have an effect on refugee law practice as a whole. In other words, will this be a new regime that endures past the current conflict, or have the new laws been targeted so closely that they are going to be limited only to the Ukrainian crisis?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think that that's an important one to think about. I mean, I don't have an answer either way, but I think that it would be really important if these sorts of laws start to inform practice. I mean, this is what happens, isn't it? When we bring in law, when we implement law, it informs practice in the future, or hopefully. So it may have an impact on what mass influx looks like in relation to temporary protection, say perhaps in Europe, and we were speaking about learning from other countries. So it very well could. And I think that's a really interesting point as to where we go, or whether it's too narrow. I'm not sure that it is. Well, okay, the problem is I suppose, is that it's been applied to Ukraine, but it wasn't applied to Syria. So I guess that in itself is a problem, that it does seem to be picking and choosing when to apply it. So I think that's a great open question that we should watch, basically, is my answer to that.
Absolutely. And certainly I would suspect that the ability of certain individuals to have access to courts where they could kind of push those claims will be limited in many regards. Mm-hmm. Let's go now to another question that came up on the chat, and also one that during our prep session we touched on. So I'm glad that we prepped it. Basically, it's the concern about the Russians who are indicating that they want to leave their country of origin, not because they themselves are in danger, but because they are concerned about the political situation or perhaps the economic sanctions, but essentially they are starting to leave either because of economic conditions or political crackdowns. Do any of these individuals yet constitute refugees under the law, or might they?
I might jump in here if I may. Is that okay?
Yeah, anybody, either one of you.
So in fact, the people who are fleeing Russia could well find it easier to meet the definition of refugee than the Ukrainians in some ways, particularly if they can show that they are literally at risk because of their particular situation. The thing about refugee law is that it works on a case-by-case basis. What we were discussing when we were prepping for this session is the effect that disputes like this have both on the migration of Ukrainians, and many of the people fleeing the country will be highly skilled individuals who actually make highly desirable migrants. But the same in Russia. You're going to see people who are really highly skilled individuals, often speak multiple languages. And in fact, they will migrate and be able to access regular migration channels. And in the past, I've seen sociologists who've done studies of various universities around the world to track what the impact of migratory events like this have had on the academy, and have showed that, you know, the outflow from Russia, for example, during the Cold War, switched over the specialization in mathematics in the US from a theoretical to a highly applied expertise, and that was reflective of the movement of people. And so I think we may well see that again with the flow of people out of Ukraine and also out of Russia.
And can I just add a fact
Yes.
in there? I just happened to notice, I think it was only a couple of days ago, I don't know if anyone saw this on the Times Higher Education. They're talking about the fact that students are being expelled for speaking out from universities, are being expelled from speaking out about the Russian war, the invasion of Ukraine. And so I just immediately thought of our discussion in relation to potential Russian refugees as being refused the right for education, etc., or on the grounds of political opinion, perhaps. So, yeah.
And certainly if we have any individuals from those regions, we just got something through you, Sydney, today that there's, I believe it's Scholars in Conflict or something similar in title, which has opportunities for those scholars and students who are from regions that are in any type of conflict, not just this particular one, but specialized kind of study abroad programs. So if there's anybody on this seminar who is in a position of danger, maybe look at that source. One of the other questions that has come in is also kind of going off the Russia situation, the Russian interference with the evacuation of refugees from certain areas. Instead of being channeled to third nations, they're being channeled to Russia, and also possible looting of humanitarian aid, that basically items that have been gathered by the Red Cross, the Red Crescent, are now being looted by Russian soldiers, etc. So do the Ukrainian refugees have any rights that they can claim with respect to either of these activities or similar types of wrongdoings?
So this is Mary. Did you want to take this one? I'm not sure if we're talking about within Ukraine while they're still in Ukraine.
There's some wrongdoing that has been alleged in Ukraine, I believe, interference with humanitarian aid, food, supplies, etc. But then there's also the issues of individuals who have been shuttled to Russia from, I'm just blanking on the name of the city, Mariupol. Instead of being sent elsewhere, they're being sent directly to Russia, where they did not intend or want to go. So that there's wrongdoings in both Ukraine and Russia now.
Okay, I might pass this one to Mary, if that's okay.
Yeah. Well, look, these are questions of humanitarian law, but I think the point is that many people have been arguing that Russia is engaging in war crimes, stopping people or targeting civilians and stopping civilians from escaping situations of great danger are crimes, and so indeed is forced deportation of individuals into another country. So these literally are crimes against humanity, and the real question is how is the West going to respond to this, and at what point are they going to stop just supplying military armaments and start putting boots on the ground? Because I think at a certain point this is going to become necessary. I'm just putting it out there.
Okay, so going back again, you know how questions are. Going back to one of the earlier points, we were kind of thinking about why there was a difference in treatment between Ukrainians and other groups. One question has been, do we think that it's mere media attention that has made the difference in treatment? Any thoughts?
Well, I guess it's a bit of a chicken and an egg, because why is there such significant media attention. So yes, it does make a difference. I mean, media attention is a huge aspect of sometimes where the world's attention is, and also what gets funded, depending on countries' own, because of course UNHCR model is voluntary funding by states, so that can all feed into where the focus of certain I suppose displacement situations are. So yes, it's that, but I guess my question is why was the media attention just here or so strong in Ukraine in the first place? And I think maybe you need to explore that or unpack that a little bit more.
Yeah. Okay, good. And I think we have time for just one more question, and maybe it's a good one to kind of tie up. This has been a very quickly evolving situation, and hard to believe, but we are only a month and a half into it. How long do refugee protections exist? And do you have any view on the long-term prospects of people who are now outside their country of origin?
I might jump in and answer this. That's a very interesting question. Refugee law is itself limited temporarily to such time as an individual meets the definition of a refugee. So changes in the country from which a person has fled can lead to refugee status ceasing. So in fact, the short answer to that question is how long is a piece of string? When Syrians first started fleeing Syria, the Jordanians and the Turks referred to them as guests. In fact, they still do refer to them as guests, but the assumption was this would be a quick turnaround. I think Zatar refugee camp on the Syrian border in Jordan was originally conceived as something that would be there for months, not years, and certainly not decades. So it's literally impossible to answer that question, Stacey, at this point, other than to say that refugee rights inhere in people who meet the definition of refugees. The convention itself, however, is quite interesting because it is in some respects, it's a mini human rights convention, and it draws distinction between individuals who are on a state's territory in a hot war situation where they've just arrived, they don't have any legal right to be there, individuals who arrive and then are given temporary status, and individuals who are settled and remain over time. So the Refugee Convention actually has quite a bit to say about that. But at this stage in the outflow from the Ukraine, it's all very new, it's all very fresh. And so the rights are going to really be prioritised from the non-reformal right, the right not to be sent back to a place where you're going to be persecuted or killed, which I think in some ways is the most important right to have. The right to health and to immediate support is also one that inheres not just in refugee law, but also in general human rights law. And so the right to humanitarian relief is something that I think is the most important at this stage of the conflict.
Excellent. Niamh, do you have any points you want to make?
No, just that I suppose the longer matters go on, it's sometimes people don't tend to come back so easily. So the long-term matters, sometimes people become entrenched in a new society, so that can affect. But my feeling is that I'm sure that Ukrainians will want to go back and rebuild. But yeah, it really, as Mary says, how long is a piece of string exactly?
Wonderful. Well, we have just hit the time, so I hope that everybody who is listening will join me in thanking Professor Mary Crock and Dr. Niamh Kinchin for their expertise and wonderful insights into what is a very complex situation. So thank you very much for your questions, and perhaps we will see you at another webinar in future. Thanks.
Thanks, Stacey. Thanks, guys.
Bye.